Hello, everyone. Finally, we have this conference to happen. We have been struggling to have this conference happen over the last almost 2 years and a half. So it was scheduled the same year when COVID-19 started, and we kept like postponing it. And I would like to thank the keynote speakers and the participants who were like patient with we were passing through, and some of them even booked their tickets to come to Doha, and they had to cancel it. But anyway, now we have it. And this conference has like a story. It started with the project we have funded from Qatar National Research Fund, National Priority Research Program, with Dr. Imad Mohammed, senior lecturer at the University of Wolverhampton, who is right now in the plane and will join us tomorrow morning in this conference. And that has been in the airport since yesterday. His flight canceled twice, and also he was very patient. And finally, he's in the plane right now. So in this project, I have Ahmad, and we have also Professor Omar Riyad from K. Leuven, who is joining us virtually right now, but also will be in Doha soon. And the whole idea behind the project was like using computational tools to make research in large amounts of data available, and to try to get some kind of like accurate answers to questions, especially when these questions are related to like the formulation of a specific genre, for like general research questions related to a specific historical moment in the history of the Arab world. And we found, I would say, a treasure, some magazines, and some of the audience here, they are students in Doha Institute, and they worked with us on these magazines, and they were also like surprised to find a lot of interesting materials in these magazines. And we started thinking about how this would work. Like we have tons of materials, and it will take us 2-3 lifetimes in order to be able to just go through them, skim them. And this is the time when Ahmad came and said, we have something to do with it through computer science. And we started that project. We got very generous fund from Qatar National Research Fund. And the project is in like the final phase right now, like by the end of April, will be done after 4 years. And also we struggled a lot because of COVID-19, especially with regard to travel and collecting materials from different parts of the Arab world. This is when the project started, and then we started thinking about creating some kind of like a network between scholars while working in this, especially if their work is related to Arabic language. And the idea of the conference came to mind, and I put a proposal, and we got the grant from Doha Institute. It's funded from the School of Social Science and Humanities. And as I said, we kept like postponing it because I really wanted to have it in person, but now we have to do it. We were ready to go in person in January, and then Omicron came to make this something unattainable at the time. So we decided to go hybrid, and some of the participants came, and some are joining virtually. Today we will start with the keynote speeches, and we have 2 prominent scholars in their fields. And thank you so much for being with us today. And I know it's very early in the United States, so thanks for taking the time to be with us. We'll start with Professor Sabry, who is a professor of computer science at Indiana University in Bloomington. His research interests are in the semantics, logical foundation, and the implementation of programming languages. He has published on a range of themes, including the typing, logical foundations, programming applications of continuations and the continuation passing style, reasoning about the phonetic effects and the stages computation and programming language model of quantum computing. Professor Sabry has many publications, and one of them includes one of the 50 most influential papers in the last 20 years of the SEM Six-Land Conference Programming Language Design and Implementation. Thank you so much, Professor Sabry, for being with us. His talk, from the title, it sounds very interesting. So, digital logic versus humanistic logic, or humanities logic. Professor Sabry, the stage is yours. Please go ahead.
Very much for the kind introduction. Thank you for inviting me, and I wish I was able to come in person. I tried twice, booked 2 tickets and canceled them. I just couldn't do the third one. My schedule was so. Apologize again for not being there in person, and thank you for the invitation. So I thought quite a bit about what to present here, and I'm going to present a historical perspective on this whole idea of the perceived, at least, clash between science and digital kind of computing and the humanities. So, Aid, are you going to advance the slides for me? Or
Sure.
Okay, thank you. So this is like the kind of perceived, at least, classification of the natural science versus the humanities. Natural science is, if you wanted to kind of give a little caption, it's about observer-independent, reality. You really want one experiment done in one place to be reproducible in another place. And this is how the scientific community kind of has these checks and testing of hypotheses and repeatable experiments and repeatable, reproducible experiments. Next slide, please. The social sciences, generally speaking, and broadly speaking, you will find that it deals with observer-dependent, facts. So it's the observer or the agent or the human interactions make it less reproducible in some sense. I'm going to qualify all of this in a minute. But this is how, at least some of the perceptions that if you look historically, there was a divide in some sense between the natural sciences and the social sciences. Next slide, please. Okay, and now to look at, how today, this is materializing itself. I'm a computer scientist, so when I look at, computing, if you ask me to sort the numbers 7186429, it's easy. Why? Because your sorting and my sorting will agree. There is no ambiguity here that 1 is less than 7. But if you ask me to sort, those paintings from most beautiful to least beautiful, well, it's very unlikely that we will all agree on what the criteria for sorting are and which one is, and what does it mean to be more beautiful. So there is clearly some kind of different perspective, different assumptions, different problems being addressed here. At least a priori, this is our starting point. Next slide, please. Okay, so the question is, can we compute with observer-dependent features instead of these, sorting of numbers? Can we compute with things that are observer-dependent? Next slide, please. Well, as soon as you mention computing and you want to ask, kind of foundational questions about computing, you have to go back to logic. We have to remember that modern computer science didn't start in the 80s. It started in the 30s, before electronic computers existed. The foundations of computer science go back to Turing and Gödel and Church, and these are people, logicians, who worked in the early 1920s and 30s. So the foundation of computation is logic. So if you want to understand foundational questions, you typically go back to logic. Next slide, please. And then ask the question, instead of can we compute with observer-dependent, programs, it's equivalent, can we reason with observer-dependent logic? Next slide, please. So you might kind of scratch your head, what does it mean to observer-dependent logic? That kind of seems like a contradiction. It seems like a no-go. If you open any textbook on logic, these are from two different textbooks that are kind of, usually we teach undergraduates from. You will find, for example, that the truth of a statement is absolute, independent of reasoning, understanding, or action. Something is true or not true, period. There is no kind of room for interpretation, room for opinion, or anything like this. And this is how at least textbook logic is viewed and taught. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's see, how did we get to this point? So this is, if you, as I said, open a textbook, this is what you see. So how did we get to this point that logic is viewed this way, at least, in mainstream presentations? Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a very biased summary. I'm picking and choosing a few points in the history because I want to kind of tell a story. So I'm starting the story from around 2,500 years ago with the, kind of like the ancient Greeks. And they had different systems of logic, but the system that today is recognizable and used is propositional logic. And I'll explain what this is about in a minute. But it's like so well established now. It's the foundation of many, many things we do. When you type in Google search, do this and this or that, that's what you're using, propositional logic. All of the computer chips, all of the gates are based on this logic. And people use it for certification, for safety guarantees, and all kinds of things. Next slide, please. Now, the logic will not be as useful if you could not automate the task of reasoning. Otherwise, you would have, a problem with being able to reason about large systems. And the credit usually goes back to Aristotle, again, 2,500 and change years ago, where logic looks like algebra. You have symbols, you have rules, and then you can, there is a symbol that's missing, doesn't matter. You have symbols and you have rules, and you can use that system to automatically derive new facts from old facts. So there is a sign, there's supposed to be symbols between the A and the B and the A. Hope that they show up in the next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, that's better. So I'm showing you 3 simple rules, and this is a little bit technical, but hopefully you will get the idea. So the first rule says that assuming A, so the A arrow B is an implication. You say that A implies B, and the meaning of that intuitively is if you assume A is true, then B must be true. So if you know some fact A is true, and you know that A implies B, and you also know that B implies C, then by chaining the implications, you know that A implies C. Okay, so you can kind of chain reasoning. You can reason a little bit here, a little bit there, and if the conclusion of one matches the premise of the other, then you can chain the reasoning and build bigger arguments. The next rule says that if I can reason that A implies B, and I have some other facts around, it doesn't really hurt. These other facts are around, doesn't matter. So if A implies B, then A and C also implies B and C. The third rule is actually the most important, and it kind of captures the intuition we're talking about. If A implies B and A is true, then B must be true. So this is where you can actually derive new facts from kind of hypothetical judgments and other facts. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I'm going to fast forward 1,200 years. I'm going to skip everything in between, and I'm going to go to the Muslim theologians around 1,000 years ago. And this is Abu Hasan al-Ash'ari. And this little argument here goes back to him. And he is trying to kind of look at revelation versus logic. So a lot of the arguments we talked about before with Aristotle and the Greek logic were known to the Muslim theologians, and they were, trying to reason about this and understand it, but they also had revelation, so they had to work hard to kind of see how to make them agree together, or kind of, if they don't agree, understand why they don't agree. So there's a little puzzle here that he posed. So I have three brothers. The good brother is in paradise, the wicked brother is in hell, and another one died as a child, and he's not in hell. So he's like in between. So the third brother can argue, using logic now, that by dying as a child, he was denied paradise. And the counter argument was, well, if you didn't die as a child, you would be bad, so you would go to hell. And then the second child says, well, why did I not die as a child? So let me try to disentangle that a little bit. Next slide, please. So if you are trying to kind of understand the argument here, you have some assumptions. And the assumptions are God knows everything and controls everything. And he is merciful and he is just. So you have these assumptions: he's omniscient and he's merciful, and omniscient can do anything and know everything. And then you have basic kind of rules that if you do good, you go to paradise. If you do evil, you go to hell. If you're a child and you die, you don't go to hell. If you're merciful, if God is merciful and somebody does evil, he can make them, he knows somebody will do evil, he can make them die early because he's merciful, he's not going to punish them. So you take the assumptions that are in that story, and then you say, well, what can I conclude when the three children were, when the three men used to be children, when they're at the beginning of their life, they were children. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I'm not going to ask you to read all of this, but you can, using the rules that I kind of gave you at the beginning, the 2 or 3 rules, in fact, the 3 rules I gave, I chose them because they are the ones used in this argument in front of you. So you can use the rules, you can kind of compose them and match them, and you can conclude using the rules and the assumptions that we have that the first boy, B1, goes to paradise, the second boy, B2, goes to hell, and the third boy, B3, does not go to hell. So you can use the rules to justify this conclusion. Next slide, please. But you can also use the rules to, in a different way, to conclude that the second B2 goes to hell and doesn't go to hell. So you can have two derivations in the logic. One of them concludes that the second boy goes to hell, and another one that says he doesn't go to hell. So this is very problematic in the logic. Next slide, please. Because if a logic allows you to prove something and its opposite, then it's inconsistent. So, an inconsistent logic is basically worthless, because as soon as you're inconsistent, you can throw away all arguments and all reasoning out of the window, because you can say anything now. Now that you're consistent, you believe A and not A, then you also believe anything and its opposite, and it's a problem that as soon as the logic is consistent, you basically throw it away. So now you have to think hard. Why is that inconsistent? What did we do to make the logic inconsistent? So there are two ways that you can reason. One of them is you can say, well, the logic is right. The rules that I presented, the three rules, are correct, and the assumptions are incorrect. So the assumptions that, if you do good, you go to paradise, God is merciful, God is this. And if you're a pure logician, like a rational point, and you never heard of revelation, you might, say that the assumptions are wrong. And just as an aside, this is essentially what the Mu'tazila kind of argued, that if you use pure religion, you will corrupt, if you use pure reason, you will corrupt the religion. But the Muslim theologians I'm going to talk about in a minute, their position was, no. The assumptions are divine revelation. We're not going to question those assumptions. We're not going to question the attributes of God. We're not going to question that he is just, he is merciful, he knows, he controls. We're not going to question any of these things. So what must be wrong is the logic itself. So they rejected the logic of the Greeks. And that was a very impressive position at the time, because something has been established for 1,000 years before, and they decided that this is not right. So next slide, please. And please, someone remind me of the time, like when it's like 10 minutes or something. When did they start? Did they start 10:10?
Yeah, don't worry, you have time.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to just again, since this is a biased and kind of my own kind of summary, I'll select three of the scholars, Muslim scholars, and kind of tell you how they reacted to this idea that revelation plus Greek kind of logic gives you an inconsistency. So, as I said, if you're a pure kind of logician and you do not have faith, then you will reject the assumptions. But they actually did the opposite, right? So they challenged Aristotelian logic. They challenged this logic. And they started developing logics that are where things are not absolutely black and white. So there's a future contingent that maybe could be true, but maybe is not true, and we don't know if it's true or false. And the logic allows you to have this gray area, these gray statements. Things may not be necessarily true or necessarily false. They start applying logic to language, and language is very rich, as you all know, and so it's very hard also to make, you need this kind of, this logic that's more flexible and less kind of black and white. And they introduced analogy as a way of reasoning to allow, again, more flexibility in the logic. So they did quite, creative work to advance logic and to promote a new logic that is not in conflict with revelation. Next slide, please. Next slide is Ibn Sina, and his logic was dominant for many centuries. And in one of the distinguishing things about the logic was that he introduced the idea of time. So things may be true now, but maybe not true tomorrow, and maybe they were not true yesterday. And again, so now this allows some variation. And today this is called temporal logic, and it's very kind of important for computing. But again, at the time, that challenges the idea that statements are true, period. No, they are true maybe under some conditions. Today, they will not be true. Next slide, please. And then I have to say my personal favorite is Al-Ghazali, and I'll explain to you why in a minute. So he understood the importance of logic. He wrote a very influential critique of the kind of the Greek kind of black and white, very sharp, logic. And he had this idea that the God is, intervening at every moment in the creation. So to explain, any action or any result or any conclusion, you cannot just use pure logic. You have to kind of always remember that God is there at all times, in every action, in every at every moment. God is there. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to fast forward 1,000 years to today. So we had, the origin from, the 2,500 years ago. We had a short kind of summary with the theologians, Ghazali and Ibn Sina and so on, Farabi. And now we are today. And today, you will find that people who are studying quantum mechanics or trying to understand quantum computing or the quantum world, and quantum mechanics is 100 years old, 100 and change, So this is very recent, that essentially you cannot have a fixed structure of reasoning. You cannot say things are true or not true independent of observers. Observers interact and change what is true and what is not true. So this is like a radical, this was, I think that it is famously known that Einstein rejected quantum mechanics because he did not like the idea that the world is not deterministic and things can change and probabilistic, and you can change facts that are true and that are false. And this was like it destroyed, all, in some sense, the whole Western science premise that things are objective. Next slide, please. So in fact, this is even more recent. This is like 2 years ago. The idea that objective reality does not exist was promoted from the early days of quantum mechanics. This was 1900s, early 1900s. But there were no experiments. Now we have actual experiments that show that really there is no objective reality, that the reality depends on the observer. This is like, again, it's very counterintuitive that, there's nothing that is outside me and you that exists independent of me and you. The examples that they give would be like, and again, this is Einstein again. He famously said this, and he was very serious. He was talking to Gödel. Gödel, he's the father of logic, modern logic. And they were at the Princeton Institute. And Einstein asked Gödel, does the moon exist when we don't look at it? And he was very serious that the moon does not exist when we don't look at it. So this is like a very counterintuitive idea, but the experiments are now confirming that really there's no objective reality. Or at least, I mean, one should always be careful when of course, the experiments could be wrong. Quantum mechanics itself could be wrong. I mean, there's always, have to be always doubtful of all of these things, but that's the best we know today. So this again confirms that the story of the three men, it's not the assumptions that were wrong, it's the fabric of logic, the logic that we baked into logic, the idea that truth is absolute and independent of observers. This idea is wrong. And so now we need to kind of maybe go back to the idea that, well, everything is observer dependent, and now rethink from scratch our assumptions in logic and computation. Next slide, please. Okay. This is why Ghazali is my favorite, because if you read his writings, you will discover, and I wish I had written this paper that is in front of you. I didn't write it, but I was reading something about maybe years ago, and I was talking to Imad, who is one of the people involved in this project, that some of the things Ghazali was saying look like quantum. And I couldn't quite kind of formalize it at the time. And then I was kind of surprised, pleasantly, or that someone else actually was able to explicitly explain the connection. So really, it's kind of remarkable and amazing that if you read the way he was explaining things, his worldview is consistent with quantum mechanics and quantum theory. So this was remarkable, that he had a view that did not presume this determinism and black and white view of the world, which I have to say, this was 1,000 years ago, and for the next 800 years, all of Europe was all about determinism, that the world is deterministic. And his work here was forgotten, and until quantum mechanics came, and now we can kind of go back and read his work, and I mean, for me, it's wonderful. Next slide, please. So I think this is, for me, one reconstruction of how the two words came together. So we had, again, I started at the very beginning that we have a word of natural science, where this is observer independent reality, reproducible facts that are independent of observers, and then the social sciences, where things are more observer dependent, and social sciences one, that it is observer dependent, and now we can kind of bring the two words together. Next slide, please. So the mutual, I mean, this is beautiful. I mean, so now it's, I mean, as a computer scientist, computing now is becoming more, so we expanded the scope of what is computable. So I started by talking about, can we sort paintings? And I don't know if we can sort paintings yet, but it is clear that music, poetry, all of these things do have computational content, broad enough notion of computation that includes these kind of observer dependent ideas. So computing now is broadened. And now here's a little game. This was an experiment done a few years ago by someone who was actually not happy with that computers can produce art that people cannot recognize AI versus human. So I'll give you a second here to think. I'll give you the answer on the next slide. So think about which is which. And if you want to vote, go ahead. Any guesses before we go to the next slide?
Go to the next slide.
Excuse me?
I'm asking the audience if they had enough time to look into A, B, C, D, and decide which one is one. Okay, I will go to the next slide.
Okay, so some people tried. So, okay, so so who said, well, I don't know what the B and C is. Is B and C or human or B and C or AI? But somebody picked A and C as special, so this is good. Because B and C are different than A and D. Anyway, so, I mean, it tells you that at this point, and it's not just that. I mean, there's lots and lots of experiments now that computers beat humans at tasks that we thought were the domain of humans. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so again, for me, what is exciting coming from the computer side is that computing now is broad enough so that we can actually apply computing to all kinds of things that used to be kind of a different, realm completely. So this is exciting. And this, again, this is, I think, mutual benefit for both communities, community of people who are kind of doing, computing, and the people who are doing all of those other disciplines that a priori did not seem to have computational content, but now we see that there is computational content in the whole universe in some sense, all of nature. And this is very exciting. Next slide, please. So I have two more slides. Okay, so this is, there's probably not enough time for even you to even digest what the implication is, but this is an amazing, amazing example. So I'm not going to even tell you about, pictures and poetry and things. This is like going to probably one, if not the biggest question, in some sense about, our existence is, free will and consciousness and all of these things. So this is, so Conway is a mathematician. Cochin is one of the quantum, leading quantum theorists. And this is a recent paper, a few years ago. And the picture on the bottom is the actual proof. Of course, it's a diagram for the proof, but it's a very mathematical proof. You can see that this is like a computational proof. And they use the laws of quantum mechanics to essentially say that if you, as an experimenter, if you believe that you have the free will to do experiment A or B, then the result of the experiment does not depend on anything in the past history. The result of the experiment is independent of your choice and anything in the past. So the result somehow is free. There is like free will. If you have free will, then the particles have free will. And the only way to explain this again is that, something that is outside of our realm is controlling those articles. And even Conway, when he's given the talk, he does say essentially God or like a supernatural. So it's kind of a remarkable theorem. Whether you agree with the interpretation or not, the theorem itself is amazing. So anyway, I just want to point this out. If anybody's curious, they can look it up. And I would recommend Conway. If you search for this, you will find 6 lectures by Conway. He's an excellent speaker, and you can watch them. They're amazing lectures. Okay, next slide. I think I like these, but 2 more slides. No, this is last slide. Last slide. Okay, so to conclude, I would like to conclude with okay, it's good that we have this marriage of digital and humanities. We have digital and humanities. This conference is a great, kind of testimony to this idea and how useful it is and how productive it can be. But I would like to personally see if we can collectively as a community give credit to Al-Ghazali and Farabi and Ibn Sina, and they not only did amazing work for the time, they, in some sense, helped set the foundations of what we're doing today with this digital humanities. This idea that logic and humanities, or revelation and science, or religion and science, this all of these kind of uh, differences, they actually helped bridge them. And we are seeing now that what they tried to do was maybe 1,000 years too early, but they worked in that direction. And this is just a remarkable, feat on their part. So I'd like to close with that, and thank you so much for your attention, and thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you so much. This is very interesting, and just to think about the idea that digital humanities started over 1,000 years ago. Now, our second keynote speaker is Professor Matthew Wilkens, Associate Professor of Information Science at Cornell University. This is not the first time for you, Matthew, to be with us at Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. You're so generous to participate in one of my classes where we were studying this topic, digital humanities, in a course about text and textualities. He uses quantitative and computational methods to study large-scale developments in literary and cultural history. His work has focused in particular on literary text mining, geolocation extraction, genre detection, and the cross-pollination of political and social scientific methods. He's the director of the very interesting project about textual geographies and a co-investigator of the text mining, the novel project. A founding editorial board member of the Journal of Cultural Analytics, and he's also joining the editorial board of our new journal with Brill on cultural analytics for Arabic and non-Arabic text. And he's the author of Revolutionary Event in Post-War Fiction. Prior to arriving at Cornell University, Professor Wilkens taught at the University of Notre Dame, where he was Ruth and Paul Essex Associate Professor in Digital Scholarship, and also at Wayne State University. He received his PhD in literature from Duke University. He got a master's degree in English from the University of Madison, and in physical chemistry from the University of California, Berkeley. A bachelor's degree in chemistry and philosophy from the College of Williams and Mary. Thank you so much for being with us. He has a very interesting title as well, Gender and the Geography of the Arab World in British Fiction. The stage is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to all of you for coming out today. Like Amir, I'm very sorry that I can't join you in person. I was looking forward to the trip, and I'm sorry it didn't work on this occasion, but I certainly hope we'll have another chance in the future. I want to thank you as well for working in English, working within the limitations of my own knowledge. I feel particularly bad in a conference devoted to digital humanities in Arabic not to be able to make even a gesture toward working in Arabic. I had originally planned to give you a sort of more general overview of the sort of state of play in cultural analytics, digital humanities, natural language processing with respect to multilingual literary studies. But I have new data that I'm excited about. And so I've decided that with your permission, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about some very new results. For that reason, my slides are a little bit unpolished. Please forgive that fact. But I do hope that we can think together a little bit at the end about some of the results that I'm about to show you. Like I say, this is brand new within the last few days, so I'm really excited to dig into it. There are two questions that I'd like to address in the talk, neither of which I am going to be able to answer in a fully satisfactory way, but both of which I think are important and interesting problems. Easy for me to say, it's my own research, but I am excited about these. The first one is a kind of classical literary history problem, and that is, how has British fiction represented the Arab world over the last 2 centuries or so? These are the kinds of problems that literary scholars have long been interested in, but have had a very difficult time posing and answering simply because of the scale of the problem. Very few of us can hold well in our heads an entire nation's literary output over several centuries, for reasons that will become more clear in just a minute, really, in my next slide. So I have some results beginning to suggest a part of the answer here. Of course, this is a large and rich and multifaceted problem. I don't pretend that I will have answered this 20 minutes from now. The second question then is, how has gender intersected with those representations? And I mean here gender in one sense, but in 2 different aspects. Both the gender of authors, it is a sort of taken as a premise of literary studies that there are some important differences between male and female writers, very unlikely to be fundamentally biological differences, of course, but culturally conditioned differences. But likewise, what about the situations in which authors of any gender place their characters? So do we see characters in association with particular kinds of situations, and does that change the way in which the world is represented? The results that I will show to you over the course of the next dozen slides or so suggest sort of one beginning of a story in answer to each of these questions or problems. In answer to the first, how has British fiction represented the Arab world over the last 2 centuries? The answer is somewhat lightly. That is to say, not nearly as intensively as British fiction has been invested in UK locations, in Western European locations, even in American locations. And generally without the same degree of geographic specificity as is given to those, I think, conceptually closer to home, maybe also sort of physically closer to home, but more importantly, conceptually closer. But there is evidence of a rise in both intensity and in the detail of the representation of the Arab world over time, particularly after World War II, so particularly over the last half century or so. In the case of gender, here there really is a sort of 2-part story. For most of the first century and a half of my study, from roughly 1800 to the middle of the 20th century, British fiction used Arab world locations in much closer association with male characters. And they were used more frequently by male authors for reasons that are somewhat complicated, and I will talk about a little more later. But we do see evidence of some important changes in recent decades, such that we have reached something much closer to parity in overall usage by male and female writers in the last 20, 30, 40 years, although they still aren't used in exactly the same kinds of ways. So that's where we're headed, and that's a sort of quick summary of these, again, very preliminary findings. Let me tell you a little bit about how this work proceeded, and then I will show you some results. So in order to do the work, I need a corpus, I need a set of books to examine, and I need a way to extract both geographic information and gender-related information from those books. The corpus consists of a little over 20,000 volumes, 20,000 books of English language fiction published in Britain, so that's our proxy for Britishness, is just a book was published in Britain, would have been available to British readers, whether it was written by a British author or not. Published between 1800 and 2009. This would go further forward, except that major digitization efforts have slowed down a bit over the last decade, which is strange and ironic, but a separate question. These volumes are sourced from the Hathi the Hathi Trust Digital Library. And as you can see in the larger of the two figures here, they are distributed somewhat unevenly by publication date. So fairly high representation, particularly in the later 19th century, so the late 1800s, a bit of a drop through the middle, and then quite a few volumes from recent years. The smaller figure on the right is showing you the gender breakdown by author gender. Green is female authors, gray is male authors, and in between in orange are authors of unknown gender. You can see that those are broadly similar to the overall distribution by publication date, although not precisely the same. There is a little bit more dramatic fall off after 1900 among female authored books. So we do not always have a constant ratio of female authorship to male authorship in the corpus, although it doesn't change radically over time. This, by the way, is an interesting finding, I think, in its own right. It's not original to me. Ted Underwood and his group were the first to observe this, that there actually really are meaningfully different representations of male and female authors in British and in American writing over the last 2 centuries or so. Okay, so that's the corpus. Roughly.
Sorry, Matthew.
Yeah.
Can you zoom in and see? Oh, okay.
Yeah. Are we?
No,
Does
go on.
that,
Yeah, just wanted
Okay.
to zoom in. Okay. Go ahead.
is that any better there?
Yeah, now it's better.
Okay. So we have about 20,000 books. All told, this is about 2 billion words, and we have about twice as many male-authored texts as female-authored texts. Okay, so now from these books, we need to extract geographic information and gender information. I won't say too much about the geolocation extraction. I've told some of you about this before. I've written about it as well. Briefly speaking, this is information taken from the Textual Geographies Project, which is a much larger project to try to extract geographic information from the whole or a large portion of the Hathi Trust Digital Library, about 10 million volumes in multiple languages, although to this date, Arabic isn't yet one of them. This is a 2-stage process, or really a 3-stage process. We use Stanford's conditional random field NER package to identify places. Parenthetically, those of you who know contemporary natural language processing are probably asking why we don't use BERT or another large language model based method here. And the answer is that if and when we restart this research, we plainly will. There are substantial improvements in named entity recognition accuracy possible with contemporary NLP, and we're headed in that direction. We use Google's geocoding to tell us where those places are. So NER gives us Paris or Mecca or Tunisia or whatever, and Google tells us, gives us a bounding box and latitude and longitude coordinates. We do a bit of hand correction on top of that. So this is relatively accurate. Our overall F1, if that means anything to you, is about 0.85. And if we ask ourselves only, like, do we get basically the nation in which a novel is set right? We're right about that roughly 96% of the time. So we think our performance is pretty good, but it certainly isn't perfect. There are errors in the data, as inevitably I think there will be when we're working at this scale. Okay, on the gender side, we have two different approaches to attributing or to attaching gendered information to each of these volumes. For authors, this is a fairly simple task, and we can do it with fairly high accuracy. We just look at first names indexed to historical usage, to the names that were given to male and female children over time. It's not the most sophisticated approach, and of course, it's prone to certain errors. You think of an author like George Eliot writing under a pseudonym that misleads about the author's gender. We do get George Eliot right because that's a famous example and we fix it by hand, but the point stands. The method is a little bit brittle. Nevertheless, we see something better than 90% accuracy on gender attribution. For characters, the task is a little bit more complicated. We need to be able to identify characters in unstructured text, to assign a gender to each one of those characters, and then to measure the amount of sort of narrative attention or narrative space given to each of them. We do that with work derived from Ted Underwood, David Baman, and Sabrina Lee's research published a couple of years ago in Cultural Analytics. I'm happy to talk in detail about the method, but suffice to say that it does a fairly good job. What that allows us to do is, while we only really have a binary prediction about author gender, we have a continuous variable representing the gender distribution within a particular book. So some books use almost exclusively female characters, have them say lots of things. They are female-oriented books. Others are male-oriented, and so forth. Because most of the books in the corpus are written by men, and because men use male characters much more heavily than women do, female authors have historically written about an equal amount about male characters and female characters, whereas male authors write much more heavily about male characters. Male characters dominate our corpus. The way to read this figure here, I don't know if you can see my pointer, is on the left-hand side, we are looking at books that have an equal, we are looking at books that have 50% or more female characters, that's this green line, or 50% or more male characters. About 3/4 of the books in our corpus are more than 50% male, are predominantly male in their character space. If we were to set that threshold at 75%, sort of gender exclusive, 40% of the books are very heavily male, 75% or more male in their character space, whereas only 3% of the books in the corpus are that heavily or more heavily female, and so on. There are essentially no all-female books in the corpus. It's not quite true, but it's very close to true. Anyway, those are our two models of gender, author gender and this distribution of character space within each individual book. Okay, let's look at some results. So the most basic way to do this, and I always think it's interesting at least to see, although it's very hard to interpret, is simply to show you a map of the places that are used by male and female authors across the whole of the corpus. Like I say, the details are a little bit hard to dig into here. I'll show you a list in just a minute. But I think the thing that ought to jump out to you immediately is both the predominance of attention to the UK and to Western Europe. Not totally surprising, but still true. But I think also the quantity and distribution of spaces outside the UK and Western Europe. It's in fact roughly 50% of that geographic attention is devoted beyond the borders of the UK. And I think that fact is interesting, but not yet entirely germane to the question that I posed at the beginning. Let's look at a version of this that zooms in on the Arab world. Incidentally, in all of this work, my definition of the Arab world is a straightforwardly functional one. I have taken the 22 member states of the contemporary Arab League. So it seemed like the easiest and least controversial definition of the contemporary Arab world, although I would be interested in your feedback on its appropriateness as a measure. What you are looking at here are locations within those 22 member states, segmented not by gender, but by location type. So the blue circles are cities, the red circles are nations. So obviously there's only one red circle per nation, but of course there can be multiple blue ones. Yellow are natural features. Those are mostly water related, the Euphrates, the Tigris, the Nile, the Suez Canal, that sort of thing. And the very few green that I've labeled region, those are sort of state level entities or regional level entities within a particular nation. Okay, so dominated by northern regions of North Africa, and particularly by Egypt and by Cairo. One of the findings here, not totally surprising, but I think not previously known about British fiction, is the degree of dominance of Egypt in the British imagination of the Arab world, really the dominant location. In fact, we can take a look at this. What you're seeing on the left is the full list of specific locations throughout the corpus and the degree of representation of each one. So London, England, Paris, that sort of thing. I don't particularly want to focus on that side. On the right-hand side, you have locations in the Arab world as defined here. And note just in passing that the numbers in terms of use per 100,000 words are not directly comparable between the left-hand list and the right-hand list for reasons that I'm happy to talk about. They're not totally different, but they don't line up quite directly. They are nevertheless directly comparable one to the other. So you can see that Egypt, Cairo, Alexandria are the major locations in the British imagination of the Arab world. But of course, attention is distributed more widely than that to Palestine, Jordan, Morocco, Syria, and so on. Well, I'll talk a little bit later about the ways in which these lists change over time, because I think that's an interesting aspect of the problem. But for now, let me make sure I'm moving forward so I don't overshoot my time terribly. At the summary level and beginning to consider the problem of gendered distribution, what you're seeing here is the fraction of all locations used in the corpus that fall within that region of the Arab world among male and female authors across the whole time span of the corpus. So again, and I've tried to be consistent about these colors in the presentation, gray is male authors, green is female authors. Two things probably should jump out to you here. Pretty consistently until recently, male authors use Arab world locations more frequently, more heavily, more consistently than female authors do. In fact, by about as much as 50% to 100% more, depending on the specific era. Incidentally, and you may be interested in this, Arab world locations account in sum for about 2 to 3% of all locations mentioned in the corpus, and about half the volumes in the corpus contain at least one location in the Arab world. Honestly, that's higher than I would have expected, given my preconceptions about British fiction, but it is the case. About half of those volumes contain an Arab world location. The other thing I think to notice here is the rising use over time, particularly among female authors. Among female authors, use of locations in the Arab world more than doubles over the course of the 20th century. There's a notable rise as well among male authors, but a kind of leveling off after 1960, 1970 or so, to the extent that we see rough parity in investment in the Arab world between male and female authors. This is true in general for other differences in geographic usage. There has been some convergence between male and female authors over time. You see bigger differences in the 19th century. It's true in British fiction. It's true in American fiction as well. We can also ask if there are particular gender associations for specific places that are different between either consistent between male and female authors, or different for those two author groups. This is a somewhat complicated figure for which I apologize, so let me see if I can explain what's going on. Each bubble in this figure corresponds to one particular place. It is sized according to the number of total references to that place across the whole corpus. So this largest dot is Egypt. This next largest one is Cairo. You will recall those are the ones at the top of the frequency list. The x-axis is among female authors. So the axis running this way is among female authors. Do those authors use that location more in books that contain more than the average amount of female characters? If so, the X position of each one of these dots will be further to the right. Or do they use the place more in books where they use more than the average amount of male characters, in which case you'll go off to the left. The vertical axis, the y-axis, is then the same thing except for male authors. So dots positioned above 0 on the y-axis are places that male authors associate more with female characters. And as you move further down the y-axis, those are places that authors associate with male characters. What that means is that there are sort of 4 quadrants to this graph, and I've labeled them in red. Those in the upper right are female locations. Those are locations that male and female authors alike are more likely to use in books that have more than the average number of female characters. So that includes Egypt, Morocco, Palestine, Tunis, Palmyra, and Algeria, although those are a little bit outliers. Likewise, the lower left are places that both author genders associate with male characters. So Syria, Mecca, Tripoli. I would be interested in your thoughts about what's driving these differences, because honestly, they're a difficult thing to explain. They require a kind of holistic sense, not only of the Arab world, but also of gendered associations in the Arab world. And I'm still trying to think through what it is that we're seeing here. As interesting as those are these cross quadrants. So in the lower right, occupied by Alexandria, and most strongly by Aden and Khartoum, these are places that authors associate with their own gender, but then that is to say differently. So female authors use these when they're talking about female characters. Male authors use them more often when they're talking about male characters. Interesting. And the upper left quadrant is what I've called cross-gender locations. So like Beirut or Damascus. These are places that female authors use when they're talking about male characters, and male authors use when they're talking about female characters. So they associate them, they're sort of doubly exotic in a way. They are associated with the other gender that these authors are trying to write about. I like this figure very much, but there's not a lot more that I can tell you about it. So this is one that I'm particularly interested in your help thinking through. Let me go quickly through a few more here because I am long on time and I don't want to abuse your patience. We could examine the spatial distribution overall by gender. What you're looking at in the left-hand side is just the same kind of bubble map that you've seen before across the whole corpus of locations used by female and male authors. They're broadly similar. If you squint at them a little bit, you can see that there is more attention to the north coast of Libya among male authors than there is among female authors. I think that's driven by the popularity of pirate tales and the sort of long-standing association of Libya in the British imagination as a site of piracy in the 19th century. I mean, these are adventure tales, non-realistic sort of stories. We can also capture a sort of overall summary here by calculating a probabilistic center of gravity by author gender and by character gender. That's what's shown here. Just to be clear, this figure does not suggest that there's anything special about these particular locations in Egypt. They happen simply to be where, if you calculate a sort of center of mass of all of the bubbles on the left-hand side by gender, where that center of mass would be. So in both cases, you can see that female authors and female characters are more associated with locations slightly to the northeast overall, and male authors and characters slightly to the southwest. So that's all I will say about that. 2 more slides, and then I will wrap up. Another piece that's interesting to me is specificity. This is an almost unforgivably busy figure, so I beg your patience with it. What you're looking at is, on the top row, reading across, the fraction of all locations for male in books by male and female authors that are below the level of the city. So for every location that we look up, we can tell, is it a nation? Is it a top-level administrative area? Is it a city? Or is it somewhere more specific than an individual city? On the top left, you're seeing that fraction within the UK. And I don't know if you can read the number, but it's roughly 20% of all locations are below the city level when British authors are talking about British locations. When those same authors are looking elsewhere in the world, they actually use as much or more sort of sub-city level detail. I think of this as like setting level detail in the world outside the UK. But that situation changes very much when they're examining the Arab world. Only 2.5% to 5% of their references are below the city level. To me, the suggestion here is that for centuries now, the British view of the Arab world has been one not so much of detailed encounter, but of abstract imagination or of exoticizing, or if we went particularly far, even orientalizing view. Is to say essentially that Edward Said was right. I don't think we needed computation to say that Edward Said was right, but this certainly was true in this case. In the bottom row, you're looking at the same kind of information, except now we're just talking about specificity below the level of the nation. So anything from the state or province level down below. In the early days of British fiction and British understanding of the UK itself, there was very high levels of sub-nation level, not many references to the UK itself or to Britain itself, in part because they would have been thinking more about England than about the whole of the nation. That drops off some, so there's more use of the British nation. I think in part more political content that we see over the course of the 20th century. You see a same general trend in among other international locations, but something somewhat flatter in the Arab world case to even a bit of rise. So big picture, I think roughly flat sort of specificity in dealing with the Arab world. Although if you want to make something of an upward tick in both sub-city level detail, setting level detail, while also seeing more devotion to the nation as a whole, I think you could tell a story about a move away from basically just looking at Egypt to a more multifaceted, multinational consideration, while also a very modest uptick in actually talking about the specific sites of the Arab world, actually setting books in particular places. It's a modest rise if it's there, but it may be there just a little bit. Okay, last data slide, this can be very quick. These are the top movers. So the locations that show the biggest rise or fall in the in attention before and after World War II. So before and after 1945. Incidentally, if these numbers look a little confusing, this is actually ranked by effect size by Cohen's d, that is to say, by the number of pooled standard deviations of difference between the two. Again, happy to talk about the methods if you like. And what you see here, there's really just one quick takeaway from this slide, which is that really the only major location that drops in frequency after World War II is Egypt. I said before that Egypt and locations in Egypt really dominate the British imagination of the Arab world. What you're seeing is a redistribution of that attention after World War II to a much wider variety of places within the Arab world. Again, I would be interested in your thoughts about what you think is driving the specific changes here. Iraq, Beirut, Saudi Arabia, Casablanca, El Alamein as well. Part of this story is plainly related to war and conflict in the from World War II through the second half of the 20th century. But I think there's more to it than that as well. Things that aren't really conclusions, but to investigate. As I just said, Egypt really does dominate and continues to dominate the British imagination of the Arab world, but there is more diversity in that representation over time. Geographic specificity, although it remains low, does grow very slightly over time. But I think if we're being honest, we still need to say that the view of the Arab world from within British fiction, even today, is remarkably undifferentiated, and therefore I think we have to conclude exoticizing as well. There's been improvement in that degree of representation, but it's modest improvement from a very poor initial baseline. And finally, there are strong historical discrepancies in the gender associations of the geography of the Arab world, both in overall usage of Arab locations, but also in the associations of particular places with different character genders. There's a movement toward parity at the author level between the genders, though that distribution remains uneven even today. And finally, truly quickly, last thoughts. 4 things that I think are required or are profitable directions for DH in Arabic. The most obvious one is the one that's most glaringly absent from my talk today. We need Arabic language sources and models. Fortunately, the prospects there are very good. There are trained large language models on Arabic, and so repeating all of the work that I showed you today using Arabic language sources is entirely tenable. It would be a little bit computationally expensive, and obviously there are complications. I don't mean to suggest that it would be easy, but all of these methods are directly extensible to Arabic language texts, and I think that that's sort of the obvious and immediate next direction for this work. In general, I think a movement toward more use of large language models in digital humanities work in general. These large language models, BERT and its descendants, really have yet to make a major impact on computational work among humanists. They've been tremendously influential among computer scientists and natural language processing researchers, but because of the degree of complication and the computational costs, they haven't yet been as influential as they will be in the longer run. And then the last 2, and these are really more sort of speculative on my own part. I would like to see in both English language and Arabic language digital humanities a good deal of increased attention to doing causal inference. You may know the sort of causal breakthrough or the causal revolution has been tremendously important in the social sciences, in sociology, in political science, in a certain version of anthropology over the last generation or so. We really don't have access to running randomized trials for the most part in humanities, and certainly not for historical cases. The past is past. We can't really experiment with it. What we do have are observational data, and causal inference is the set of techniques specifically adapted to drawing causal conclusions from observational data. Seems to me like an obvious sort of next direction for DH in general. And finally, as I mentioned, the role of causal inference in the social sciences, I think a general sort of rapprochement between the humanities and the social sciences would be immensely profitable for both. This isn't just about learning useful techniques from the social sciences and bringing them over to the humanities, although there may be some of that, but it's also about opening up the historically rich and very large data sets that we have access to do a better version of social science, so that they can get, a historically long-ranging study that currently might be 10 or 20 years in the social sciences. We can offer the prospect of working at 2 or 3 or 10 or more centuries in a way that really isn't available to the social sciences for the most part. So with that, I will thank both the funders of the work, to whom I owe a great debt, and I will thank you very much for your patience and attention with the talk that ran somewhat long. Thank you.
I think the opening session with these two keynote speeches are paving the floor for some interesting papers we have in this conference. Unfortunately, due to the postponing the conference, we lost some of the participants, but we still have some very interesting papers in the conference booklet. You will see all of them tomorrow and after tomorrow. Usually, we do have like discussion after the keynote speeches, but if you allow me, we'll have 2 minutes if they have any questions. Please go ahead. Okay, we have forgot the audience online. Okay, please go ahead, and then we have one question also from the room here.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Matthew, very much for this captivating talk. It's really enriching, and since we're working on Orientalist research on the Arab world, especially Egypt, of course, and since you brought up Said's argument, if your findings are in line with Said's argument, what are the odds? What are the new perspectives opened up through your research? What are we doing if we are just maintaining given arguments?
Yeah.
Of course, I'm asking myself this question because I'm involved too in the digital humanities and social sciences marriage, as you called it.
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent question. I think this speaks in part to the current state of knowledge in the humanities as we work to translate arguments that have been made with reference to a handful of texts to this much larger historical span, and to incorporate what you might call an approximation of the full range of literary output. So part of the answer is that it's worth something to me. It feels important to me to know whether an argument that is undoubtedly correct with respect to a very small subset of the literary world also holds true about the sort of full range of literary production. In other words, while I certainly didn't start with particular skepticism of Said's argument, I was essentially convinced by it, I didn't know before doing this work whether or not it accurately captured the range of British output that Said, of course, can't possibly bring into the original development of that argument. I think now we know something about the way that British literature operated over 2 centuries that we didn't know at the beginning of the work. In this case, it seems to suggest that Said was at least on the right track, or that his arguments are mappable onto this much larger literary domain. I will say that it doesn't always work out this way. So, for instance, in some previous work focused on American literature, The critical consensus was that American literature had become substantially more international in its orientation over the last century or so, that it started out sort of inward looking, and that the characteristic feature of the development of 20th century American literature was outward to the rest of the world. That is true of a very small slice of American literature, sort of high prestige, award-winning, not best-selling, but what feels to literary scholars like an important piece of the literary world. But it is flatly not true about the rest of American literature. And that's an important difference. I mean, that says that a critical argument that has been very persuasive to other critics really has no basis in the larger run of American fiction, that we need to rethink what happened about the relationship between American authors and the rest of the world over the last 100 years. So that's a case where we were sort of fundamentally wrong about our understanding of the world. So it didn't happen in Said's case, but in this previous work on the American case, potentially a really important change. And so I think we always need to be open to that possibility that the things we think we understand just might not be true. And that is, to me, that's again, sometimes you confirm what you thought you knew, sometimes it's overturned. I don't necessarily want to overturn it, but I do want to know when it's wrong.
That's highly informative. Thank you, Matthew, for this piece of information.
Thank you.
And encouraging also for us to go on with our digital humanities research and excavation.
Thanks. We have another question. Please go ahead. And if you don't mind introducing yourself.
So my first question is, you are working with a big corporate, but my question is it written totally by British writers, or does it contain maybe translated content from Arab novels, French maybe? The second question is, you said that you designed and flexible and fast query tool. Is it available for researchers sites in another project? Thank you.
Yes, thank you both for those questions and for coming closer to the microphone. I'm sorry that I was having trouble before. The answer to the first question about whether the corpus contains only British authors is no, it does not. It also contains work in translation, and it contains work that we know is by authors who are not from Britain. That said, we have done some sampling from this large corpus. Depending on exactly where we are in the historical distribution, often 90% or more of the books are by British authors, though there are times when it's as little as about 2/3 that are British authors. Others are by authors who immigrated to Britain and published there. Still others are translations or imports or that sort of thing. I think in that case, it's best to imagine this as a representation less of British literary production than of the British literary marketplace. These are the books that would have been available to British readers wherever they were produced in the world, although there's substantial overlap between those two sets. And the answer to the second question about the query interface is yes, it is available. It's at txtgeo.net. I will put it in the chat, although I understand that for those in the room that may not be especially helpful. It is flexible. It is fast. The underlying data tend to need a bit of hand correction for particular purposes, for particular targets. And those are corrections that, while we have applied some to the overall data set, I will simply warn you in advance that there remain errors and you will want to look into the data before you rely on it entirely.
Thank you so much. Okay, Maria.
Keynote, really, it was very fascinating. I have a question to Professor Sabry regarding his dwelling on Al-Ghazali and his contribution to the whole debate and paradigm he was discussing. Maybe it's a very stupid question, but it's actually for information more than that. It is not. What about the classical logic works which were written in Arabic? They were influenced by the Greek logic for sure, but did you check in that in order to see whether also in classical Islamic thinking, besides Ibn Sina and Al-Ghazali, other people who wrote about logic from an Arabic perspective also could contribute to the debate?
I've been trying to, so thank you. I've been trying actually to kind of, I mean, it's a vast, amount of information. It's a little bit outside of my area, but I've been trying to read. But you notice that even with Ibn Taymiyyah had a very kind of important also analysis, or at least kind of writing on logic and its place. And there was, I mean, okay, when I said Ibn Sina's logic was the most popular one, there was a lot of back and forth and critique. But I think at the end of the day, logic became suspicious, and people, kind of stopped working on that. Probably, and not sure exactly when, maybe a couple of 100 years after that period. There is still a lot for me at least, a lot to learn about the topic.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adil. Go ahead, please.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, I was just wondering about the computational tool that you have used to extract, to define whether the character is male or female, and did you manage to specify whether it's a protagonist in the story or is a side character? And thank you very much for a very interesting talk, both of the keynote speakers.
Thank you. That's a great question, and I didn't get to say as much as I would have liked. So in order to do gender attribution, we look for gender indicating signs like the pronouns attached to characters or honorifics like Mr. or Mrs. or Lord or Lady, that sort of thing. We also rely some on those same lists of standard names, which have gender, first names, which have gender associations, though we use those only in cases where we don't have more direct evidence from pronouns and from honorifics. Again, accuracy up over 90%. So we do pretty well, but of course we make some mistakes. Fortunately for us, those mistakes disproportionately affect minor characters. So now to the second part of your question. Yeah, so we judge the sort of importance or the weight of a character simply according to the amount of narrative text that is attached to those characters. So we can construct a dependency parse of every sentence in, throughout the book, and then we can say, how much text, how many words does each character speak? What is said about them? What adjectives are attributed to them? What do they possess? And one or two other little pieces. And then we just say, imagine that each book has a total fixed amount of character space to distribute. We give that character space out to each character according to the total number of words fractionally attached to each one. So a major character who speaks a lot and who is spoken about a lot, who does many things and has things done to them, might occupy as much as 30 or 40% of the space, the character space in a book. A minor character who's only mentioned once will occupy less than 1% of that space. So that's the way we distinguish between major and minor characters. the reason I say it's fortunate that our gender errors are disproportionately distributed to minor characters. The reason is we just don't have much evidence about them. There isn't much that's said about them, but they also don't take up much of the total space. So we do very well with major characters. Our performance is a little spottier with the minor ones, but they don't matter as much. So
yeah, using dependency parsing is a good idea. Perhaps if you, I don't know, but this is traditionally happening in fiction, is that major characters usually come at the end and come at the beginning. So this is something you might want to think about as well. As for the interpretation of the data about how Egypt is not as focused in the fiction as we go on in time, perhaps this is a little bit correlated. I'm not sure really, maybe correlated with the British occupation of Egypt that started in 1914, 1916, and then perhaps by the end of World War II, the political arena has changed, so perhaps the focus is not as much. I'm not really sure, but this is the first thing that came to mind when you mentioned that Egypt is not in the focus anymore.
Thank you. Yeah, that's super helpful. One of the things that we've found about British fiction in general is that there is surprisingly little investment with the sort of peak period of British colonial expansion through the late 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. And again, outside the Arab world, we really only see a turn toward the former colonial space after the era of the great colonial independence movement, so starting through the 1960s and 1970s. I would like to see my own data about Egypt with better temporal resolution than what I showed today, because I would be super interested in knowing whether it follows that same pattern, whether you do start to see that shift away, even as Britain is increasing its colonial investment in Egypt proper. If so, it would be mirroring something we see elsewhere. And we're still trying to explain what's going on with that. It's really counterintuitive.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Thanks, Amr. And we really enjoyed your talk. And I look forward to another opportunity to have you here, both of you, in person in Doha. Thank you so much for your talk. And I hope you will also be able to join the next 2 days for the presentations we have in this conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
And likewise, thank you so much.
Thanks.